Good evening. My name is Sandra Voltero, and I'm your host this evening. This is Be Prepared, and this is our December show, and we're here talking about food poison prevention and food safety. And tonight my guests are here with me. Next to me is Marlene Johnson, who was our health agent for the Burlington Board of Health for the past 11 years. She previously was the health inspector in Woburn and in Boston. Welcome.
Thank you.
Next to her is Carrie Cesbordes. Welcome, Carrie.
Thank you.
She is the manager of community resilience and preparedness at the Cambridge Public Health Department in Massachusetts. She's also worked with chemical cleanups and affected food storage. And next to her is Wagas Buddha, who is a program coordinator for the Regional Center for Poison Control and Prevention in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And he's also responsible for education outreach for poison prevention in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Welcome, Wagas. Let's get started. Let's talk a little bit about, let's start with you, Wagas. Can you tell me just a bit about the Regional Center for Poison Control and Prevention and just what you do?
Sure. The Regional Center for Poison Control and Prevention, it's based at Boston Children's Hospital, and it's been operational since 1955. And since 2000, we've also been serving Rhode Island as well. So basically, the Regional Center for Poison Control and Prevention, it has a helpline that's available 24/7. The poison helpline is 1-800-222-1222, and people can call at any time with any inquiries regarding poisonings. If they want some information regarding a potential poisonous substance, for example medication, or they feel that they've been exposed to a poison, they can call the number. And we have, the helpline is manned by nurses and pharmacists, and they're available to answer any questions.
Okay.
And just one more thing, we also have toxicologists on board, because we also get calls from hospitals regarding complicated medical cases. So they're also available to offer advice. And our services are free, and
Okay, thank you, August. Marlene, what is food poisoning?
Well, food poisoning, also known as foodborne illness, is a disease that is caused from the consumption of contaminated food or beverages. And primarily it's caused by a bacteria, a virus, or a parasite. And sometimes it can also be caused from a toxin or a chemical, such as poisonous mushrooms.
Wow. Okay, so how does the food actually become contaminated?
It can become contaminated in many ways. It can be contaminated during the production, even during growth. For example, produce can be contaminated if it is irrigated with contaminated water, and contaminated water meaning animal manure or even human waste. It can be contaminated during the processing, such as slaughtering. It can also be contaminated at a restaurant from an employee who doesn't wash his or her hands, also from improperly holding the food, improperly cooking the food. So there's many areas where something can fail.
Really? Well, Gus, what are the common poisoning agents?
it depends on what age group we're talking about. If we're talking about young children, who are specifically those who are below 5 years of age or 5 years of age, then they can be exposed to a wide variety of substances, because young children, they basically, like, the younger they are, like, they'll get into anything. They'll eat anything. They're curious. They have hand-to-mouth behaviors.
Yeah.
So you could be looking at cosmetic products, for example. You could be looking at household cleaning products, because many of them, they're brightly colored. They're similar to juices, etc. So those are some of the cases that we come across. Some of you may have heard about poisonings due to the Tide detergent pods. They're brightly colored, and, like, kids, they've been exposed to them. And we also have cases of, let's say, this was major news on CNN also, like hand sanitizer poisonings. Hand sanitizers, they come in a wide variety of flavors. They're brightly colored, and, like, children, they might, like, ingest the stuff. So with kids, it's common household products and medication as well. Even if they have too much vitamins, they could be poisoned. For example, too much iron in younger kids, it can lead to a wide variety of complicated problems, including death.
Right.
Yeah. So, and recent trends, we've seen a lot of cases of liquid nicotine poisonings in young kids. Liquid nicotine, it can, like many people, they use electronic cigarettes in the household now. So liquid nicotine can be fatal to young kids. We've also had a case in New York where there was the first fatality due to e-liquid poisoning. So that's something that parents should be aware of. And with seniors, they're usually on multiple medications, and the more medications you take, the more chances of interactions. So with seniors, it's mostly medications. We could be looking at, let's say, common substances, for example, Tylenol, right? Tylenol can interact with other medications, and if you have too much of it, it can cause problems as well. You could be looking at, let's say, poisonings due to cardiovascular drugs, drugs that seniors are taking for cancer, antidepressants. So with seniors, they're usually on multiple medications, and these can cause interactions if not used properly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Definitely. So, and also there's a problem with grandparents visiting their children.
Exactly.
And they have these little containers with no
Yeah.
markings on what it is.
Absolutely.
And if a
yeah.
child takes something, you don't know, you call up the poison center, you can't even say which one they took.
Right.
Right, so it's important that the parents, the children of the elderly should know what their parents are taking.
Yes.
So in case something like that happens.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
serious. Okay, so how are foodborne illnesses diagnosed, Marlene?
How often?
Well, how?
How are they diagnosed?
Yeah.
Well, they're diagnosed when somebody becomes ill and they don't seem to be getting any better. And then they reach out to their doctor, and the doctor may have them come in and submit a stool sample. And that's really the only way to confirm that it is a food poisoning or foodborne illness, because at that point you can identify the pathogen, being a bacteria, maybe it's a parasite, but usually that's how you can get the confirmation of it.
Yeah, and what is the most common foodborne illness?
There are several. There are Salmonella, Campylobacter, E. coli 0157H7, and norovirus.
It's quite a bit, huh? So how do we protect ourselves, right? In restaurants and so forth, you don't know, right?
Well, if you are somebody who has a weakened immune system, if you're elderly, if you have young children with you, or if you are pregnant, when you go out to eat, you want to make sure that you really pay attention to the menu. If there are foods that are prepared undercooked or raw, you may want to stay away from those. If you order a burger, you want to order that to 160 degrees Fahrenheit, so medium well to well done.
At least, I would think, yeah.
Yes.
Wow. So, Carrie, how do chemicals get into food, and where do they come from?
So chemical contaminants are basically adulterating substances, so they impact the safety and quality of food. They can get into foods in a number of ways. In fact, some chemical contaminants are actually natural toxins. So an example of that could be what Marlene mentioned, which is mycotoxins from fungi. Basically, there are aflatoxins, which are fungal toxins that grow on crops, such as peanuts, tree nuts, cereals. Marine toxins are another example of naturally occurring toxins. So this could be from a harmful algal bloom. Like paralytic shellfish poisoning is a type of poisoning that is from marine toxins, specifically dinoflagellates. They form a toxin called saxitoxin, and basically, as with all chemical toxins, the cooking process doesn't eliminate the toxin. So unlike some biological contaminants, there's really nothing in the cooking step that you can do to avoid the natural toxins. There's also chemical residues that can appear because of the use of pesticides, insecticides, fungicides, and herbicides. And the EPA actually sets what's called tolerance residues or pesticide residues for crops. This is based on, it's a risk assessment essentially that's conducted when the pesticide is registered for use with the EPA. And it's something that the FDA and the USDA enforce. There's different levels depending on the pesticide and depending on the crop. Also, as Marlene mentioned, chemical contamination can happen throughout the manufacturing, storage, distribution, and preparation process. So really you've got to be thinking farm to fork, because the food can be adulterated at any step in that process. And accidents or unintentional spills or unintentional additives, even things from food packaging can migrate into foods. And then there's the category of intentional adulteration. So in that sense, we're thinking about direct contamination. And in terms of emergency preparedness aspect, we're thinking about the role of food defense.
Yeah, something like they may contaminate.
Exactly.
All
So,
the food,
so this
or-
would be an intentional act. It could be a disgruntled employee. It could be domestic or international terrorism. It's something you want to plan for. It's something you want to evaluate and assess your vulnerabilities and exercise and have plans in place to deal with that.
Absolutely. And do we have to concern ourselves with medication as far as
Absolutely.
someone
Sure.
contaminating our medicines?
Sure,
Yeah.
and certainly medications, it could be any number of toxins. It could be cleaning supplies, as was mentioned, hand sanitizer, things like that. And the role of the inadvertent or accidental is something to consider as well. If an employee is using hand sanitizer instead of washing their hands, then they go on to a food preparation step. That hand sanitizer can get into the food, especially if it's something that's served ready to eat.
Right. So that's not always good either, to
Right.
use hand sanitizer. Wow.
Yeah.
Interesting, isn't it? So tell us about some of the other ways in which some people are likely to contact a foodborne illness.
There's cross-contamination. So when you are cutting raw chicken, for example, and then you use the same cutting board or the same knife to then cut into lettuce that is a ready-to-eat food item.
Yeah.
So that's another way. Also, not storing food properly. So there are foods that require temperature, control. And if they are not being held at a proper temperature, for example, 41 degrees or below for cold holding, then anything above that can allow for bacteria to grow. The same thing for hot foods. If foods are not kept hot enough at 135 degrees Fahrenheit or higher, then those foods also can have the potential to grow bacteria and make somebody ill.
Goodness, what we have to think about, huh? So what about the contamination of animals, like when they go to slaughter? How do they become contaminated?
They can become contaminated through the juices, or I should say the contents of the intestines. And if that is contaminating the meat, then it stays within the meat and somebody can become ill.
And what about eggs? I understand that the salmonella can get into the shell of the egg or something before they even hatch.
That is true.
So how does one prevent something like that?
From what I've read, you can prevent it by starting with chickens that are free from salmonella, and you keep them separate. If they're hens that are laying eggs for consumption, they need to be kept separate. You have to watch their feed. You want to make sure that their feed does not become contaminated. Wild birds cannot get into it because they can contaminate it as well.
So if they're free range, you're saying they could get into the bird stuff that would contaminate?
Wild birds. So if
Wild
wild birds came into the flock and started to get into their feed, they could potentially bring the salmonella into their feed.
Wow, lots to think about, right? Would you like to share anything else, Carrie?
Sure. In relation to, I was thinking in terms of backyard flocks and hobby chicken keeping. And one of the things that we stress in Cambridge and is important is that you source your chicks from reputable breeders. You need to be thinking from the start about preventing things like highly pathogenic avian influenza, and that's another reason actually to keep your flock separate, especially from migratory waterfowl. So that's something to keep in mind if you have free-range chickens. And it's something to keep in mind in terms of biodefense planning. Is that there not only salmonella, but there's other potential illnesses there. In terms of salmonella, we stress that children under 5 should not be involved in the care and the feeding of flocks or backyard chickens. And again, that's to prevent exposure in young children that are particularly susceptible. And with shell eggs, you want to make sure that you receive the shell eggs for sale at temperature. So that would be, I believe, 41 degrees or 45 degrees or below. So those are some things to keep in mind.
Lukas, could you tell me some of the statistics on how many people get poisoned a year, and children also?
Well, based on data collected at the Poison Control Center, for Massachusetts, we had approximately 37,000 calls at the Poison Center in 2015, and of those, 89% were poison exposures. So we're talking about, let's say, above 33,000 calls that we logged in, they were poison exposures. And of these, almost half of these poison exposures occurred in children who were 5 years of age or below. And 5% of the poisonings occurred in seniors. We're talking about people who are 65 years of age and above. Now, although the poisonings in seniors were less as compared to kids, seniors have more risk of fatalities because, like I said earlier, they're usually on multiple medications.
Right, and the immune systems aren't as strong as a younger person.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
And I just want to stress that this is data from the Poison Control Center, and it does not represent the total poisonings that occur in Massachusetts, because obviously you have to look at hospital admissions, etc. as well. So the total poisonings are obviously much higher.
Absolutely. And what about like for children under 6? I understand that's pretty high too, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, so tell us why the Poison Control Center is important.
Well, the Poison Control Center is important because, like I said earlier, we have nurses and pharmacists at the hotline. We also have doctors available for complicated medical cases. So people are getting expert medical opinion free of cost, right? And the Poison Control Center, apart from providing this medical service, it also saves people money on unnecessary healthcare costs. So if, let's say, somebody, God forbid, has been exposed to a poison and they call the Poison Control Center, you know, based on the data at our Poison Control Center, 70% of the calls that we handle, people don't have to go to the emergency room. They can take care of the problem at home. So it saves them money.
Sure.
Right? So, and we did some research in 2012 that for every dollar invested in Poison Control Centers, it saves $13 in healthcare costs per person, right? So the Poison Control Center is important that way. And we've got research that shows that 50% of the visits to the emergency room, they're unnecessary. And that's important to know when we're talking about young kids. Obviously, if your young child has been exposed to a poison, you know, we're parents and, you know, we're concerned for our kids. Our first instinct is to go to the nearest emergency room.
Right.
So the Poison Control Center, it can serve them in that regard, like it can, like, you know, provide them advice and save them money.
So what is the Poison Center doing to get that message out to people? I mean, in their homes, do they all have, you know, something from you that tells them what to do?
Right, right. I'm glad you asked that. So the Poison Control Center, we have education outreach activities throughout Massachusetts and Rhode Island. So with regards to seniors, we work closely with the senior centers throughout Massachusetts and Rhode Island. We do that through the Council on Aging, and they have numerous locations throughout Massachusetts. We also work with public schools to try to provide poison prevention education to parents and teachers, especially of kids who are at the kindergarten level. And we also work with daycares and daycare centers and nursery schools for children who are even younger.
Okay, yeah, I was thinking that those are the ones you want to really reach,
Exactly.
is the young people.
Exactly. And apart from these, we also work with YMCAs, for example. So we try whenever we can to go out and speak directly to people. And in many cases, we also provide them poison prevention health materials that they can utilize.
That's good. Yeah. And parents should teach their kids how to, where your number is and how to dial the number.
So
and
we
so
have
forth.
numerous tools for that. We have magnets that they can put on their fridge. We have stickers that they can post at various locations.
That's good.
Yeah.
Okay. So, are there any other poison that we haven't mentioned that you'd like to mention? Anyone here? Or chemical? Or
I can talk a little bit about environmental contaminants.
Okay.
So these could be things like methyl mercury in seafood, or heavy metals in food, or things that are related to food storage, like bisphenol A in food contact surfaces. So in terms of the environmental contamination, there are fish advisories in Massachusetts for certain bodies of water, particularly directed at pregnant or nursing women or young children. And mercury is mercury is the result of man-made contamination in our environment. It deposits from places like power plants. It can travel very far in the air. Deposit in bodies of water. They're taken up by fish. It bioaccumulates. It becomes an organic toxin, methyl mercury. So that's something to be aware of, and something that the state keeps a close eye on. Environmental contaminants like lead can show up in soil, in industrial areas or former industrial areas. It's also a result of using leaded gasoline many years ago. So that's a concern for exposure to people who are working in gardens and working intensively in the soil. So using raised beds and importing clean soil is a method to prevent that exposure.
Yeah, that's good to know. It's good to know. So any last comments before we go on? I know the next month we're going to talk more about prevention and things we can do in that case. But as far as any more poisons and so forth, any more comments you want to make before we end this segment? August?
Well, basically with regards to medication, with seniors, obviously, like I mentioned, it can be a wide variety of drugs, but I want to say with regards to parents of young kids, it's sometimes the things we don't expect that can poison young kids. And, with kids, it's a wide variety of things beyond medications. We're talking about toys that can also be choking hazards as well. So that's something that parents should be concerned about as well. And be on the lookout for brightly colored substances, because children can be attracted to them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's really scary when you think of all the things you really have to think about with your children, and your animals. I mean, animals can get into those cleaning sheets,
Right.
for softeners, and that doesn't get digested from what I understand. So
Right.
that's very hazardous too.
Right.
So
Since you mentioned animals, I just wanted to point out that there's also another poison helpline for animals as well.
Excellent.
Yeah.
That's good to know. Well, we'll have to start wrapping up. Next month, we're gonna, hopefully you guys can be back next month so we can talk more about prevention and what we can do to take care of ourselves, and what the public health departments are doing to look out for our welfare as well. Anyways, I think that's all we have to say on this subject. I think we'll close for this evening, and we'll be back in January to talk about poison prevention and food safety. So that's it. My name is Sandra Voltero, and we be prepared, and we try to present to you every month a show on health, wellness, and safety. Thank you for joining us.